Good evening. Hey, everybody. I'm Patrick Lewis, Director of Collections and Research here at the Filson. Thank you for joining us for tonight's lecture, which is brought to us by our event sponsor, Dinsmore and Scholl LLP. Thanks again for joining us both in person and virtually for The Soldier's Truth, Ernie Pyle and the Story of World War II. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to remind those of us joining in person to please silence your cell phones for the duration of the program. As I say all the time, it will be somebody. Don't let it be you. We'll have a short Q&A session at the conclusion of the program. If you're joining us virtually, please drop those questions in the chat. If you're here in person, we have mics on either side of the room. Please just get in line on either way, and we can alternate and take turns. Be good neighbors. For those folks who purchased a dinner ticket, we will head over to Buck's at the conclusion of the lecture. You're welcome to leave your car parked here in the Filson's lot. Now to the fun part. David Chrisinger is the Executive Director of the Public Policy Writing Workshop at the University of Chicago's Harris School of Public Policy and the Director of Writing Seminars for The War Horse, an award-winning nonprofit newsroom dedicated to reporting on the human impact of military service. He's the author of several books, including Stories Are What Save Us, A Survivor's Guide to Writing About Trauma, and the recipient of the 2022 National Council of Teachers of English George Orwell Award. Thank you for joining us tonight. Please join me in welcoming David Chrisinger.
Well, thank you for that lovely introduction, and thank you all for being here this evening. It's always an honor for me to be able to talk about Ernie Pyle with folks who. But I'm curious, just to show of hands, how many people are familiar with Ernie Pyle? Okay, so that's not always the case. It's been a while since Ernie has written anything, but I have a very brief reading I'd like to do, but first I thought I would tell you the story of how I came to find Ernie Pyle. I know the exact date, actually. It was Memorial Day, May 2016, and I was in Okinawa, Japan. I was there doing research about my own grandfather who served during World War II. He was a tank driver during the Battle of Okinawa. And like many of the men of his generation, he didn't talk very much about it. He died without us really knowing what he had experienced. And so being the family historian / writer, I decided I was going to, try to figure out what he had gone through, what he had experienced. And I was really fortunate. I found some of the records from his military unit, and some of those records included maps and directions and sort of summaries of where they were, what kind of action they saw. And so I hired a local historian in Okinawa to take me to all those places so I could retrace the steps that my grandfather took during the battle. And at the end of our tour, he took me to one more place. It's called the Cornerstone of Peace. And it's a huge memorial on the southern end of the island of Okinawa. And if you've ever been to Washington, D.C. and you've seen the Vietnam War Memorial, this memorial was inspired by that. And so they have these waves of black granite that face the ocean. And on those markers, they have the names of 240,000 people who lost their lives during the battle. So if you've been to DC and you've seen the wall, that's 58,000. So imagine 240,000, right? It's a magnitude, obviously, much greater. And the tour guide that I was with, he said, do you know any of the names of men that your grandfather served with that might have been killed during the battle? At that point, I didn't have that sort of level of detail. And so I probably looked a little awkward, a little sheepish. And he said, oh, don't worry, I'll take you to a name that you will know. And he took me to the wall where it says Ernest Taylor Pyle. And see, it's always somebody. That's it's okay. It happens in my class all the time too. So he showed me the name. He said Ernest Taylor Pyle, and he kind of stood there like, and I'm being honest with you here, my very first reaction was, oh, is this the guy that they named after Gomer Pyle? Because I remember watching Gomer Pyle with my dad when I was a kid, the reruns on TV. And that's not a crazy question. If you've been to the wall in DC, you might have seen the name John Rambo on the wall. So they took the name John Rambo from the wall and used it in all the Sylvester Stallone movies. So that's where my mind was like, oh, someone saw this name and they came up with Gomer Pyle. Well, he looked at me like I had two heads, and he said, wait a minute, you've spent years researching your grandfather's story. You traveled 7,000 miles to be in the same ground where he served, and you don't know about Ernie Pyle. You're trying to understand the soldier's experience and you don't know Ernie Pyle. He said, as soon as you get home, you're gonna buy two books. You're gonna buy Here Is Your War, and you're gonna buy Brave Men, both by Ernie Pyle. And he said, start there and then, go from there. And it was true. I mean, once I read Ernie's writing, it was like, well, of course, if you want to understand what it was like to be a soldier on the ground, on the front lines during World War II, you have to read Ernie Pyle. And my sort of fascination with him grew from there. I started figuring things out about him. He has a very fascinating life, but he's also a trendsetter in a lot of ways. We know about what's happening on the front lines in Ukraine because there are war correspondents who are on the front lines, living with the soldiers on the, living in the trenches. They didn't do that before Ernie Pyle. When Ernie Pyle started his reporting during World War II, the model that the other correspondents followed was that they would wake up in the morning, they would go to a briefing from one of the general's aides, they would figure out where the action was taking place, and a couple of them would jump in a Jeep and they'd run to the front lines or maybe just behind the front lines. They'd ask a few questions, maybe be there long enough to get shot at a couple of times, and then they would go back and they would go to the back of the lines where it was safe, and they would write their dispatches and they would get them censored and they'd be sent off to the United States. Ernie didn't want to do that. Ernie wanted to live with the troops. He wanted to give what he called the worm's eye view of the war. So he lived in the mud with the soldiers, and he stayed out there for weeks at a time. And this was a totally novel approach. People didn't do this before. That's just one of the things that is impressive about Ernie's work, and again makes it so we can't cover a war without someone doing what Ernie Pyle did, even today. So I have a few pages I'd like to read to you, and then I have a couple more stories about Ernie, and then I've got some time for some questions. But thank you again for all being here. A warm summer rain soaked the men as they mounted muddy tanks and stuffed themselves into half-tracks or jeeps pointed east. The smell of soggy gear and idling engines overpowered the sweet scent of the honeysuckle that climbed the gray siding of a nearby three-story inn. In a darkened shed out behind the inn, a 43-year-old pipe cleaner of a man sat hunched over his portable typewriter, ankle deep in straw, his back curved like a cashew. This morning, we are sort of stymied as far as movement is concerned, he pecked out with his index fingers to his wife back home in New Mexico. So in order not to waste the day, I dug up a white metal table out of a nearby garden. After nearly 3 months of hellish fighting through the hedgerow country of France, the Americans and their allies were 30 miles from the center of Nazi-occupied Paris. Capturing Paris had never been part of the Allies' plan, which involved a strike through to the Low Countries, across the industrial heartland of Germany, and straight to the heart of Berlin. The Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in Europe, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, had grave concerns that if he marched his men into Paris, they would likely bog themselves down in a brutal street-by-street combat with seasoned enemy troops and reduce one of the world's most magnificent cities to a charred graveyard. Not even an impassioned plea from the French commander, General Charles de Gaulle, had been able to dissuade him. Then, on August 22nd, 1944, the French Resistance's chief of staff, Roger Gowa, slipped through German lines on the outskirts of Paris and found his way to General George S. Patton's headquarters. The situation on the ground was not what the Americans thought, Gowa told General Omar Bradley's chief intelligence officer. The resistance movement in the capital city had infiltrated the police force, and the week before, 15,000 Parisian policemen had gone on strike. More than that, the tens of thousands of resistance fighters had risen up to attack and harass their Nazi occupiers, even though they were armed with not much more than antique rifles and Molotov cocktails. In the days following the police strike, many more Parisians of all ages and abilities dug up paving stones, collected piles of furniture and other odds and ends, and felled trees to construct an elaborate network of more than 400 street blockades. Even though they were outnumbered and now outmaneuvered, the Germans were nowhere near outgunned and would eventually crush the insurrection and inflict untold amounts of suffering and destruction as they retreated east, unless the Allies came to the rescue. This new intelligence quickly reached Eisenhower, who dispatched the Free French forces under his command to liberate their capital with American and British backup, while the rest of his forces pushed east and north toward the Belgian border. On August 25th, 1944, Liberation Day, after a brilliant sun burned away the morning mist, Ernest Taylor Pyle, better known as Ernie to his millions of readers back home in America, stuffed his typewriter into its case, slung his musette bag over his shoulder, and hopped into a Jeep with a couple of fellow combat newspapermen. Through most of the early part of the day, they felt their way through garden-like country toward the outskirts of Paris, far behind the lead tanks and the more daring Allied correspondents, such as Robert Capa, Ernest Hemingway, and Don Whitehead. The outer rings of the city hadn't been bombed much, Ernie was heartened to find, and most of the bridges were still safe to cross. Not at all desperate to be the first to secure that coveted liberated Paris dateline under their bylines, Ernie and his companions entered the city from the south, along the Rue d'Orleans, where they discovered a pandemonium of surely the greatest mass joy that has ever happened. Women in brightly colored blouses and skirts lined the wide city streets in a carnival-like frenzy, leaving only a narrow corridor of pavement for the hulking military vehicles to navigate. Aging veterans of the Franco-Prussian War stood at attention, saluting their liberators. Excited children bounced and waved. Some ran along jeeps with their hands extended, hoping for a shake, but settling for slaps on the back or pats on the shoulder. The demented choir of shrieking shells and zipping machine gun tracers the Allies had expected to encounter that day had mostly been replaced by cheers of Vive la France and Vive l'America, even as pockets of German resistance in the city remained. They tossed flowers and friendly tomatoes into our Jeep, Ernie later reported. One little girl even threw a bottle of cider into ours. Once, when the Jeep was simply swamped in human traffic and had to stop, he wrote, we were swarmed over and hugged and kissed and torn at. Everybody, even beautiful girls, insisted on kissing you. At least one ecstatic woman with full pompadour and flashy earrings reached out to grab Ernie by the slack in his collar. Before he could protest, she pulled his gray-bearded face, smudged with dust and lipstick, to her wine-colored lips. Thank you, oh thank you, she squealed. Thank you for coming. We all got kissed until we were literally red in the face, he later recalled, and I must say we enjoyed it. At long last, Ernie's ability to relish in the beauty of the world at war, something he feared might have atrophied inside his chest, suddenly flickered back to life. After inching through so much gratitude and joy for about an hour, Ernie had the driver pull over in front of a hotel near the Luxembourg Palace, across the river from the Louvre. They'd heard scuttlebutt that there was any number of desperate Germans holed up in the palace, firing indiscriminately at anything wearing green. While others fought, Ernie and the other two press correspondents wrote their first dispatches from Paris in a room overlooking the street below. I had thought for me there could never again be any elation in war, Ernie wrote of that joyous day. But I had reckoned without the liberation of Paris. I had reckoned without remembering that I might be part of this richly historic day. The day after the city was liberated, Ernie and crew puttered over the Seine and past the Place de la Concorde and the gardens of the Champs-Élysées. From there, they meandered their way to the gilt-edged Grand Hotel, across the street from the Allied press camp, taking shape inside the Hotel Scribe. Like Mary and Joseph, when Ernie and his companions arrived at the Scribe, they were told there was no room at the inn. Not long after the Nazi propaganda officers who had occupied the hotel had fled, some 200 Allied correspondents, under an emotional tension, a pent-up semi-delirium, moved in and set up shop. Through the gilded lobby of the Grand Hotel, up a set of marble stairs, and down the carpeted hallway, all the way to the corner, Ernie found a room with clean sheets, but no electricity. From the balcony 3 floors above the street, he grinned down in the afternoon sun at the joyous abandon below. After so much darkness, grateful Parisians had found the light. Standing there with several other correspondents, in as genteel a way as his tongue could muster, Ernie quipped, "Any GI who doesn't get laid tonight is a sissy." As the sun began to set, Ernie and his buddies made their way back across to the Scribe and claimed a table near the bar on the far side of the room. The booze did what Ernie wanted it to. It dissolved him. Soon, a couple of dozen war correspondents had him encircled, eager to hear a tale or two from the little man everyone loves so much. At one point, the other famous Ernie, that's Hemingway, bellied up to the opposite end of the bar with the swagger of a lonely warlord, seemingly resentful of Pyle's command of his hangers-on. Slap! Hemingway stung the air with a heavy hand on the bar top, a grenade he carried with him just in case, pulled on the inside pocket of his field jacket. "Let's have a drink here," he spat from the corner of his bearded mouth. The bartender babysitting Ernie and his buddies turned. Hemingway motioned for him. "I'm Ernest Hemorrhoid," he roared across the room. "The rich man's Ernie Pyle." He was such a jerk, wasn't he? Around 11 o'clock, in between rounds of cocktails, air raid sirens wailed, snapping everyone back to reality. In a raid of vicious retaliation, German bombers flew low over the rejoicing city, dropping their payloads and strafing anything that moved. Back suddenly was the little knot of fear in Ernie's stomach. Back was the animal-like alertness for the meaning of every distant sound. Back was the perpetual weight on his spirit that comes with death and dirt and noise and anguish. Gin saddened, Ernie Pyle realized he had reached his limit. What should have felt like a gigantic relief, celebrating the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany, had become another opportunity to die. The German air raid killed as many as 200 people who probably thought that their war was over. Another 900 were wounded. The next morning, Ernie sent a telegram to his longtime editor, dear friend, and amateur business manager, Lee G. Miller. About done up, he said. Physically, everything was fine, but, Ernie added, he was dogged clear down inside and can barely keep columns going. The final German raid had brought home the truth. Ernie was wrung out. There was nothing left to give. It was time to come home. So I start the book there at the liberation of Paris, which you might say, isn't that sort of late in the war? It is. Ernie started his career as a war correspondent really during the Blitz of London in 1940. He went there as basically a travel writer, because that's what he had done all through the Depression. Was he traveled all around the country. He went to every state. He went to most of the provinces in Canada. He went all over Central America, South America, and this is at a time before the interstate system. He's driving cars that, don't have it in them to go across the country 35 times, but somehow he did it. He rode with his wife, Geraldine. Everyone called her Jerry. Ernie called her the girl that rides with me. And they rode together all through the Depression. He wrote columns 6 days a week. He had, at the time he went to England, he had about 24 or 25 papers that covered his column, that subscribed to his column, which is impressive. But at the height of his popularity as a war correspondent, when he left France, there were about 400 newspapers that covered his column, and he was being read by 12.5 million people every day. There's nobody in America today who can say that. Even the most popular TV personalities, they might get that many viewers in a week. Ernie got them every day. His column ran 6 days a week, all through the year. He wrote about 700,000 words about the war. That's about 7 books worth of material, just in a few years. So he goes to London. He covers the bombing, the German Blitz, and his popularity soars. People are really impressed with his reporting. He's not the stereotypical war correspondent, right? I think when I thought of war correspondents, I thought of like tall, good-looking, dashing, young men. Ernie was in his 40s. He was a very short man. He only weighed about 110 pounds. He had white hair. He did not fit in anywhere that he went, but because he didn't fit in anywhere, he actually fit in everywhere, if that makes sense. He was really good at being a fly on the wall, of just sort of absorbing himself into a scene. People sort of forgot that he was there. They would tell him things that they wouldn't tell other correspondents, because he was living with them, and he was doing the same things that they were doing, and a certain amount of trust built up. And what Ernie found was that he really, really enjoyed the work, but it was very taxing on him. So he went back home. And remember, at this point, the United States is not officially engaged in the war. Pearl Harbor happens at the time that he planned to, or at the time that Pearl Harbor occurred, he had planned to go to Asia to cover the war the Japanese were fighting in Asia, to try to cover that. That plan got canceled right after Pearl Harbor, and he was really kind of stuck with this, like, what do I do now? Do I enlist? Do I try to become an officer? Do I stay as a domestic reporter? Do I go overseas to be a war correspondent? He really didn't know what he wanted to do. One thing that really spurred him, though, was that his wife was very ill. And Jerry, I explained some of her symptoms to a couple of doctors, and obviously there's plenty of issues with trying to diagnose someone from 80 years distance. But both of the doctors I talked to said it sounded like she had bipolar disorder. And this would have been at a time before that was a recognized illness, before there was medication, before there was any kind of treatment. But every time Ernie would leave, she would get worse. Then he would come back, she would get better. Then he was getting ready to leave again, she would get worse again. And right after the war started, she got this really intense kind of premonition that that Ernie wouldn't survive the war, that if he went to cover the war, he would never come back, and she would be sort of left, abandoned at home in New Mexico. Right before Ernie decides to go cover the war, Jerry has such a bad episode that she's actually institutionalized. And just to give you a sense of how they handled mental health issues in the 1940s, that's a whole other book. Jerry's doctor recommended that Ernie divorce her to shock her into not being so depressed. That was the leading medical thought at the time. So they actually did get divorced. They were remarried later by proxy, because it didn't work. She didn't get better as a result of that. But really, this was sort of like Ernie didn't have anything going on at home. His wife was institutionalized. There were gas and tire rations. He wasn't able to crisscross the country anymore. And so he asks his draft board to give him permission to go overseas and be a war correspondent. Now you might be thinking, his draft board, didn't you say he was in his 40s and he only weighed 110 pounds? Well, at the beginning of the war, the army was so small that they needed people who had specialized skills. And so lots of newspaper reporters were being drafted not to become infantry soldiers, but to become press officers, or to become censors, or to become intelligence analysts, or something where they could use their skills of communication. That's what Ernie thought was going to happen to him. His draft board gave him permission to go overseas. They said, you have 6 months, so make the most of it. And in that 6 months, his column got so popular. This is right after the invasion of North Africa. His column got so popular that his draft board gave him a non-deferment deferment, because they said he would better serve the war as a correspondent than he would in any other capacity. So he really has this sort of unique position where he's not, writing to a daily deadline. He's able to spend time with the troops. He can sort of find the stories that he wants to tell. And what he ends up doing really is he ends up what he calls writing the soldiers' letters home for them. So he wrote the things that soldiers would have liked to be able to write in their letters. That's what Ernie reported back to America. And I think that was what readers really, really wanted to know. Of course it matters who's winning the battle, how many casualties there were, that sort of thing. But what people really wanted to know is, what do they eat? Where do they sleep? What is it like to be in combat? What is it like to be up for 3 or 4 days? What is it like to march 60 miles across the North African desert, right? Like, these are the kinds of questions that Ernie could answer for people in his column. And the readership that he developed gained and gained and gained. He really solidifies himself as kind of, an excellence above everyone else during the Italian campaign. This is where he writes probably his most famous column, which is The Death of Captain Wascow. Anybody familiar with The Death of Captain Wascow? Okay, a few people. This was his most famous column. It became a scene in the movie about his life, the story of G.I. Joe. And at that point, he was so famous as a correspondent that soldiers started recognizing him. And actually, by the time he gets to France, General Bradley said that his soldiers fought better when Ernie was around, because they wanted Ernie to write about them and wanted their, the folks back home to be proud of what they were doing. So he, travels all through North Africa. He goes through the Sicilian campaign. He travels all through Italy. He's at the invasion of Anzio. He's nearly killed there by a German bombing. And then he ends up back in England getting ready for the invasion. He lands the day after D-Day, travels all over Normandy, writes a really incredible series of columns about the D-Day invasion. And that's actually where this book starts, because in 2018, 2019, I was working as a columnist for the New York Times, and the 75th anniversary of D-Day was approaching. And my editor kind of put out this call to some of the columnists and said, anybody got some good material they want to write about for the 75th anniversary of D-Day? And my hand shot up so fast, and I said, I want to write about Ernie Pyle. I told the story. They said, yeah, let's do that. Let's run that story. And I said, great. Can you send me to Normandy? And they said, no. But we can send you to Dana, Indiana, which is the Paris of the Midwest, to be fair. Dana, Indiana is Ernie's hometown, and you have to try really hard to get there. There's really no way to get there on accident. But they saved his childhood home. They turned it into a museum. It's a world-class museum, honestly. And I got to spend a lot of time with people who really loved Ernie, who have dedicated parts of their lives to helping to keep his memory alive. And so I wrote the piece. It came out on the 75th anniversary. And the next day, my editor called me and she said, 1 million people read it. I said, what? She said it had 1 million downloads in the first 24 hours. It broke every record that our column had for the number of downloads in the first day. That blew my mind. That blew my agent's mind. My agent was a little concerned that nobody would remember Ernie Pyle, that this would be, this would be sort of like, Ernie who? But ever since then, now it's been, 5 years, ever since then, I'd say at least 2 or 3 times a month, I get an email from someone. I still get letters from people who read the piece or found my book or found something that I wrote online, and they want to tell me about what they know about Ernie Pyle. They want to tell me how their dad used to talk about Ernie Pyle, or how their grandfather was actually written about by Ernie Pyle. I just got a message 2 days ago from a guy whose dad was featured in an article that Ernie wrote from Sicily. And I put a Google alert for Ernie Pyle while I was doing my research, so it would tell me if anything new popped up about Ernie. And more often than not, what I was alerted to were obituaries, where people wrote in their obituary that they had met Ernie Pyle, that they had been written about by Ernie Pyle, that their unit was written about by Ernie Pyle. Like, it became a major milestone for people. If you go to Indiana University in Bloomington, where Ernie's archive is located, they have entire shelves full of scrapbooks that people kept of Ernie's columns that after he died, they sent to Indiana University hoping that they would be saved. That you know, because Indiana made it clear that they wanted to start the Ernie Pyle archive. That's Ernie went to college in Indiana. Didn't graduate though. He left with 1 semester to go. And he left. I saw the look on your face. That's the exact same look I'm sure his parents had, you know. They were not too thrilled, but Ernie's justification was he had gotten a job as a reporter, and isn't that the whole point of going to college, is to get the job? And he got the job, so why finish college? And you know, the rest really was history. So that was a day after the article came out. 2 days after the article came out, I got an email from an editor, and he said, I read your piece about Ernie Pyle. I read your piece that you wrote about your grandfather. If you ever want to write a book about Ernie Pyle, let me know, because I'm all in. Now, I can tell you, after having written several books, that's not how it usually happens. Usually the publisher doesn't find you. You have to beg the publisher. It's usually the other way around. So I got on the phone with him, and he said, his name's Scott, and he's a fantastic editor. And he said, okay, pitch me. How would you do this book? Right? You know, Ernie Pyle's been written about before. There are other biographies. How are you going to be different? And I said, I think I want to do what I did with my grandfather. I want to go back to all these places, and I want to retrace Ernie's steps, and I want to try to see what kind of impact. Maybe there is none, maybe there's a little, maybe there's, you know, a ton. But I want to go North Africa, Sicily, Italy, France, the Pacific. I want to go to all these places and retrace his steps, find out what there is to find. And I can tell you, all across the world, people still remember Ernie Pyle. And in fact, there is a tiny, tiny little village in Normandy. And when I say tiny, I mean it has a city hall, it has a church, it has a cemetery, and it has about 10 houses. That's about it. And if you go to the city hall in this tiny little village, there is a placard that is dedicated to a column that Ernie Pyle wrote about that village. That is still, after all these years, their sort of like claim to fame. And there's a little tour. They have a sign that you can go and follow all the places that Ernie went. You know, we're talking 8 decades later. I mean, that's incredible. So that's what I did for this book. I retraced his steps. The editor loved that idea. And the thing that's really sort of like spooky about this whole thing is he said, well, what are some books that you think are, you know, in line with what you're trying to accomplish? What, you know, because that's what you have to do when you pitch. You have to kind of say it's like this and it's like that, but not really, right? And I said, I think this book is kind of like Confederates in the Attic. Anybody ever read Confederates in the Attic? Really fantastic book, came out in the 90s. The author, Tony Horwitz, wanted to understand, why does the Civil War still sort of captivate so many people after all these years? And he went to figure that out by becoming a Civil War reenactor. And he retraced all these different battles and got to know all these different people, and he builds this kind of collage. And so I said, I think I want to do something like that. And then there was this long pause on the other end of the line. And I thought, crap, I just blew it. He doesn't like the idea. What am I going to do? How do I course correct? You know? And he said, this is Scott, my editor. He said, well, you know that I was Tony's editor. And I swear to you, I had no idea. And I think that long pause was him going, okay, sure. Right. Like, you did your homework. Fine. Right. But I said, no, I didn't know that. And here's the other thing. Tony had just passed away. He had a brain aneurysm. He died like 2 weeks before this. And so my editor told me, he said, if you want to write this book, type up a proposal, let's do it. The world needs another Tony Horwitz. And that is what has brought me here today, is the book The Soldier's Truth. The title for a long time was The Unhappy Warrior, because Ernie had a good friend that he met in college, and they were pen pals all through their lives. And when Ernie was in France during that time that I read in the beginning, he would sign his letters to Paige, his friend, Ernie Pyle, the Unhappy Warrior. And I thought, oh, that just really kind of captivated who Ernie was. Like deep inside, he was a very sad, very kind of melancholy person. But on the outside, he had to be this famous person, right? This famous writer, this correspondent. He had obligations. He had New York Times bestselling books. They were making a movie about him. You know, he was a celebrity before we had celebrity newspapermen. And I kind of lost my train of thought there for a second. He was so famous that it was actually quite easy to find lots of material. So when I put together that beginning chapter, you know, and I'm talking about Ernest Hemingway, and I'm talking about, you know, these other reporters with him in this hotel, and we're talking about the scenes on the streets. What was great was Ernie wrote about that. He wrote about it in his letters. He wrote about it to his friends. And then all of those people wrote about it too. And so I got to sort of triangulate from all these different perspectives. And that's what I think really gives this book a really rich kind of color, is that there's so much material to pull from that I could really paint these scenes of what his life was like. And it's been a really incredible journey. And I still get to come out to places like this and talk about Ernie and answer questions about him. And I'm happy to do that now if anyone has anything that they're curious to know more about.
I'll throw one out there. Tell us a little bit about the censoring that went on, and what obstacles it was to journalists.
So, you know, unlike now, where reporters are free to report what they want, Ernie and the other correspondents, they were essentially staff officers. They essentially were a part of the army. They relied on the army for uniforms, for material, for food, for security, for travel. So General Eisenhower basically said, you know, correspondents are staff officers. They work for me. That's a very different scenario than we have now. The press officers also were charged with censoring any of the reported material that came out of the war zone. They were pretty heavy-handed at times as the war progressed, and as it became clearer that the Allies were going to win eventually, they started letting more things through. It's sort of an interesting analysis you can do looking at the reporting from North Africa versus Italy versus France versus the Pacific. Whereas like North Africa, even battles that were complete, you know, debacles get reported as, don't worry, folks, everything's okay. You know, we might have gotten licked, but don't you worry, we're going to be right back. You know, don't you worry, we're going to beat the Nazis. Don't worry, right? A lot of reporting like that. Once you get to France, it's a lot more vivid, a lot more realistic, a lot more sort of open to discussing the real human costs of the war. And this was very purposeful. They wanted people to be invested in what was happening, and they wanted the American people to know that it wasn't easy, that what we were asking soldiers to do was not a walk in the park, and it was going to take a lot, and we didn't know when it was going to end, but we knew we would win eventually. So the censorship sort of evolves over time, but in the beginning, Ernie wasn't subjected to censorship in the same way that other correspondents were, because other correspondents had to worry about, am I giving details that would help the enemy? Am I giving details that would lead to, you know, the home front being more fatalistic or more defeatist in their thinking? Ernie didn't really worry about that stuff because the reporting that he did was totally separate from those topics, right? But I think that was actually part of his genius as a writer, is that he could tell these very human-centered stories where he put a human face on what was happening, and people would read it and they'd say, well, there's nothing here that violates, you know, the rules about discussing troop movements, or, you know, Like they weren't allowed to talk about race relations. That's one thing that was censored, between the relationships between white and black soldiers. Couldn't talk about that. Couldn't talk about mental health. Couldn't talk about shell shock. Couldn't talk about wounded soldiers in any kind of detail, right? Those sort of details in the beginning were hidden from the American people. But Ernie found these creative ways to write about it anyway. And for example, the death of Captain Wascow, that column is the first time during World War II that an American correspondent wrote about a specific soldier who was killed, who named the soldier, described how they were killed, described what happened afterwards. Like that was very new in terms of what was able to be reported. And who knows if it's a true story or not, but the narrative goes that the press censor who read the death of Captain Wascow was moved to tears and didn't cross out anything in the column. Yes, so that's another way that Ernie and other folks tried to talk about mental health, was describing the way that the soldiers sort of behaved, but without giving it any sort of name. Like Ernie wouldn't be able to say these soldiers are shell-shocked. He would say they had a 1,000-yard stare, their eyes are hollow, they slump forward when they're, when they're marching, they, and it was through his description that he was able to paint a picture that would give a reader that same conclusion without him necessarily labeling it. I don't know for sure. That didn't come across my desk during my research, but it's possible. In terms of newspaper reporting, though, being able to write about soldiers going through traumatic experiences and the ways in which they were dealing with that was a very touchy subject, and something that Ernie tried to find ways to kind of circumvent. And in that way, I think he was, I don't want to call him subversive. I think it's more creative, right? He knew there were things that he wouldn't get away with saying, and so he found other ways to tell those stories so that people would still understand it. And in fact, when he decides to leave France, he writes in his column, he says, "I'm done. I can't do this anymore. I've been in battle too long. I can't sleep. I can't think. I can't make sense of this anymore." And again, I think because he was writing about himself, they let those sort of things go. Whereas if he had been writing about other people, they might have been more sensitive about it. So that's just one part of Ernie's reporting that I found really captivating, was the way that he kind of innovated around the censorship. But basically everything that got published or that was written about overseas and then was sent home was censored to a certain extent. And that comes back later during Vietnam, when correspondents have a very different kind of mentality, and they have a different sort of mission in their minds, where they're there to sort of find when the generals are lying, or they're there to blow the lid off of some corruption, or to expose something that happened that was wrong. Ernie saw things that happened that were wrong, and he couldn't write about that. He was there during the Battle of Kasserine Pass, when the Americans were basically steamrolled by the Germans in their first sort of foray into combat with the Nazis. And Ernie writes about it like, the high school basketball team that lost by 2 points on Friday night, right? It was sort of like, hey, don't worry, we might have gotten our butts kicked, but we're going to get them back next week, right? It was that kind of tone, and that's very different than what you see in his reporting from France, where it's much more. For example, he has a column where he's describing this infantry platoon that's assaulting a building in Cherbourg, and he actually writes the line, "These young men are not heroes." And I remember when I read that, I was like, wait a minute, Greatest Generation, right? This sort of doesn't jive with that. And he said, they're not heroes, they're young men that went to school with your kids, that grew up down the street from you, that worked in the grocery store, and now we put a gun in their hands, and they're over here, and they're fighting not because they want to fight, but because we ask them to, and they win their battles no matter what we ask them to do, right? And it was that kind of reporting where he wanted to sort of level set people to say, this is what it's really like. And so that's where the title The Soldier's Truth came from. Was my editor said, you know, the unhappy warrior, I don't know if people are going to want to buy a book with unhappy in the title. And I said, well, that's fair. And he said, well, what really sums this up? And I said, I think it's that there was a truth. Is it the truth, the only truth? No, but it's the truth that the soldiers wanted people back home to understand. And that's what Ernie did, regardless of censorship. Yeah.
Did Ernie have a relationship with Bill Maudlin, who gave him little snippets of daily life?
Oh, yes. Him and Bill Malden were actually very close. They met in Italy, and Bill Malden was a cartoonist, William Joe. And there's lots of similarities between the kinds of cartoons that Bill Malden did and the kinds of writing that Ernie Pyle did. Bill Malden was a soldier, so he wasn't a correspondent. He was kind of doing cartoons on the side. And then Ernie helped him find an agent and helped him get his cartoons published in the United States because he was so impressed with Bill's abilities. And then when Ernie dies at the end of the war, sorry, I didn't want to spoil it, but he dies at the end of the war. Bill Malden said the difference between a soldier dying and Ernie Pyle dying is that when a soldier dies, he's mourned by his platoon or by his company. When Ernie died, he was mourned by the army. So they were close. Yes. Not in this book, but I do quote from a lot of his reporting. If you're curious to read a collection of his best columns from World War II, there was a book that came out in, I think, 1986. The title is Ernie Pyle's War, and it has a collection of the full columns printed. Some of the best, not all of them, but some of his best ones are included there. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, the question was, did I republish any of the columns, or do I have any of the columns in full in the book? And I said, no, I didn't, but I quote from them pretty extensively, especially his most famous ones. Yeah. Oh, about me. Oh, sure. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's a good question. So let's see, where do I start this story? So 2014, I was teaching what I think was the first of its kind writing class for student veterans at a university in Wisconsin. And so my entire class was made up of Iraq and Afghanistan war vets who were coming to college. And some of them had gotten off the plane 2 weeks before and were sitting in my classroom. And my job was to do two things. One was to teach them the history of veterans coming home from war, from the Revolutionary War to the present. And then the other was to teach them how to write a personal essay about their own experience. So the idea behind the class was you learn the history of what people have experienced coming home from war, and then you add to that history. And we wrote a book in that class that I edited that includes all my students' writing. We won an award from the governor. The curriculum was expanded to the entire University of Wisconsin system. And then the budget got cut and they let me go. And and right at that time, I met a man named Thomas Brennan, who started a nonprofit newsroom called The War Horse. And if you haven't read any of the War Horse website, I'd check it out. What they do is incredible. What they do is they publish personal essays written by military service members and their families. So you can really get a sort of human impact of the war. You can better understand that. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because the War Horse, Ernie Pyle, is the original War Horse. So when I met Thomas Brennan, I asked him, I said, where does the War Horse come from? Because when I heard War Horse, I was imagining horses, equine therapy or, something like that. And he said, no, that comes from Ernie Pyle. And I said, what do you mean it comes from Ernie Pyle? And when I was doing research for this book, I found the letter that Ernie wrote where he had decided that he was going to go to the Pacific, where he met his end. but he decided he was going to go to the Pacific, and he said, I'm going to go warhorsing across the Pacific. And when I looked up that phrase in newspaper usage, the first usage that I found was it being used to describe Ty Cobb when he went from being a manager player back to being a player at the end of his career. And they said that he was acting like an old warhorse. And I got the impression that that wasn't a good thing, that, you know, it was basically they had done one too many campaigns. And that's how Ernie saw himself, was that he had done one too many campaigns. So I started working for the Warhorse newsroom, teaching people how to write and how to write their stories and publish those stories. And then the last 5 years, I've been teaching public policy writing at the University of Chicago, where I teach graduate students how to communicate persuasively and to communicate clearly about politics and public policy. And I get to use lessons from Ernie Pyle all the time. Ernie was an incredible advocate in terms of getting policy changes, getting people to see things differently, seeing in a new way. So I sort of came at Ernie Pyle from a few different directions. It was like, you know, I know how to write. Ernie's a good writer. I teach people how to write their war stories. I wanted to tell Ernie's full war story. And then, you know, I started working as a columnist, and I wrote that piece, and it sounds a little bit like kind of all over the place, but it's all been very kind of serendipitous. Yeah. Well, yes.
I enjoyed your book. You prompted me to do a lot of extra reading. I think one of the things I read is that you did your first book event at the museum in Dana. Is that correct?
It wasn't my first one, but I did do an event in Dana. Yep.
The museum is closed for the season.
Right.
Would you mind just telling us a little bit about it?
Sure. So it's Ernie's childhood home, and it's this sort of white clap, you know, siding farmhouse. He grew up on a what do they call that? Where you're a farmer, but you don't own the land. Tenant farmer. Yes. And so they have the house, they have all of, you know, his stuff that was in it. You can walk through it and see his cradle that he, you know, was a little baby in. And then out behind the house, they have these two big Quonset huts that are full of displays that relate to the different phases of Ernie's career as a war correspondent, and just really, really incredible exhibits. Like the D-Day example, they actually, or his D-Day columns, they actually built like a beachhead and have, you know, all this gear and stuff kind of washed up on the beach, and you can read his column above it. It's a really, really incredible museum. I go back there whenever I'm close enough to get over there. It's in Dana, Indiana, which is about 40 miles west of Bloomington. So, you know, Bloomington's not on an interstate. You have to go off the interstate, go to Bloomington, then you have to go west. You sort of drive on these roads that, and you could drive right past it and miss it. It's, you know, one street, basically, very small town, but worth the drive. Yes. What happened to Jerry? So Jerry, during the war, her illness got worse and worse. She attempted suicide a couple of times. The last time she attempted suicide was right before Ernie decided to go to the Pacific. She was institutionalized several times in that span. And in fact, one of my good writer friends who wrote a blurb, Brian Kastner, wrote a blurb for this book. And after he read it, he texted me and he said, "So let me get this straight. He put his wife in a mental institution so he could go cover the war. Am I getting that right?" And so it was a little bit more complicated than that, but that essentially is what happened. So when he was killed, she was told, obviously, she went into a deeper depression than she had been in, and she actually passed away later that year from some complications that she had been experiencing. But some people argue still to this day that she died of a broken heart, essentially. Yeah. So I wish there was a better story to tell about Jerry, but that's one thing that I was really committed to doing with this book, was really telling Jerry's side of the story. In lots of the previous treatments of Ernie Pyle, Jerry's kind of either in the background or in the shadows, or she's referred to as, like, you know, the wife with the mental illness, you know, that Ernie had to deal with, which wasn't exactly accurate. Wow, good question. Did he deny himself, or was he just, I think he was prone to bouts of depression. He had a kind of melancholy disposition even before the war. He used alcohol regularly. That wasn't uncommon at the time, especially when there wasn't medication to deal with a lot of the things that they were dealing with. But I think that prepared him for once the war started, that he had that different lens. He could sort of see people for those little things that they may want to hide from everybody else. He really could understand what that was like. And I think it gave him a language and a vocabulary that other people didn't have, so that he could articulate those things much better. I also think that there's, if it's not a cause and effect, it's at least a correlation between depression and creativity, right? To be able to navigate those depressive feelings through some kind of creative outlet. Lots of writers battle depression and anxiety and other things. And so I think all of those things, made it so he was better at what he did. But I don't know that he sort of consciously denied himself of things, or if he just sort of found that it was easier in some ways to take the road of suffering, right? And that there were good things that happened because he suffered, but that suffering took a toll over time, for sure.
I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about Ernie's legacy within the profession of journalism. We've touched briefly on Vietnam. We've touched briefly on Ukraine. Sort of how is he remembered, taught, understood to students?
Well, I got to interview a correspondent named Joseph Galloway, and he was a correspondent during the Vietnam War. He covered the Edrang Valley campaign, wrote a book called We Were Soldiers, Once and Young, and then that was turned into the movie We Were Soldiers with Mel Gibson. I got to interview him back in 2019, and the reason I interviewed him was because he told me I became a war correspondent because of Ernie Pyle. That I wouldn't have chosen this profession if it wasn't for him. I met lots of people like that. There's another correspondent named David Wood. He won a Pulitzer kind of during the height of the Iraq War. But he was very much a kind of Ernie Pyle correspondent. He lived with the troops. He told their stories. And he told me the same thing. He said, I became a correspondent because of Ernie Pyle. So I think there's that sort of nostalgic kind of, he's this very sort of saint-like figure in the war correspondent world. For a long time, the Indiana University Journalism School was named after him. Now it's called the Media School, which I think is a way worse name than the Ernie Pyle School of Journalism. But they didn't ask me. And during the Vietnam era, I mentioned this briefly, during the Vietnam era, there was kind of a reappraisal of his work. Some of the correspondents during that era started to see Ernie as, they called him a cheerleader for the war. And some of the sort of less flattering commentary, people even said he was a propagandist. I disagree with that. Every single person I talked to, when I went journalists, when I told them that, they would interrupt me and they'd say, no. He wasn't a cheerleader for the war. He was a cheerleader for the soldiers. And that's different. And so I think that, and now working with the War Horse, this nonprofit newsroom, one thing we hear all the time is, how come there are no Ernie Pyles? How come there are no Ernie Pyles today? And I always have to say, no, I think there are Ernie Pyles, but that's just one part of their skill set, right? Journalists have to do everything now, right? They have to do investigative work. They have to do human interest. They have to do quick hitting news bite stories. They have to do longer feature stuff. It's like everybody has to be everything. And Ernie didn't have to do that at the time. Would he be as successful today as he was back then? I think he would be. Mostly because he was just an amazing storyteller, and he was so good at understanding people and getting people to help him understand what was going on. And I think that's a timeless skill set. My editor at the New York Times, when I pitched this idea, she said, oh yeah, we learned all about Ernie Pyle in journalism school, right? So I think he is one of those figures. This is something sort of tangential, but I was having a conversation a few days ago with one of my students. His name's Matt Ryan, and he's a West Point grad, served 8 years as a infantry officer and as an intelligence officer. Now he's a student at the Harris School of Public Policy. And he was in my office hours, and he said, you know, when I was at West Point, we learned the stories of the heroes. Like we learn the stories of the battles and the soldiers that did something extraordinary, and we learn those as a way to sort of like, this is what you should become, or this is what you should be. And he said, in public policy, we don't really do that. We don't have heroes that we point to. You know, maybe it's a politician, but you know, then half the country doesn't think that they're a hero, and right, and it's like just sort of complicated. And I said, you know, there is something to that, of like having the stories of the heroes, right? Having models that you can follow, having someone you can maybe not put on a pedestal, but at least like strive to get closer to. And I think a lot of correspondence for them, that was Ernie Pyle, that they wanted to be like Ernie Pyle, but they wanted to also surpass Ernie Pyle.
Well, that's all the time we've got for tonight. Thank you all for the really robust
Yes, thank
conversation.
you.
A round of applause.